Nothing feels wrong anymore. Not because everything improved, because repetition taught you to stop detecting what changed. The interruptions stayed, the pressure stayed, the noise stayed, but your reaction to it slowly disappeared. You adapted to the rhythm, to the movement, to the constant fragmentation of attention. And after enough repetition, the abnormal stopped feeling abnormal at all. That is how normalization works, not by forcing acceptance, by removing comparison, until one day the condition that once felt invasive starts feeling natural, and the moment something feels natural, you stop questioning whether it belongs there. The most stable systems do not depend on persuasion. Persuasion creates resistance. Long-term normalization works differently. The environment repeats the condition continuously until the nervous system stops identifying it as disruption.
The behavior remains, the detection mechanism fades, and once detection disappears, adaptation begins to feel voluntary.
Nothing needed to arrive suddenly. That would have been too visible. The environment changed slowly enough for your perception to adjust with it. The noise became constant. The interruptions became expected. The movement became automatic. You stopped experiencing stimulation as something entering your attention. It started feeling like the default state of reality itself. That is why most people never notice the shift happening. Because repetition does not feel dramatic. It feels familiar. You wake up, you check something immediately. You reach for input before silence fully appears, not because you consciously decided to, because the movement already exists before awareness catches up to it. And after enough repetition, the action stops feeling conditioned. It starts feeling natural. That is the moment where normalization becomes difficult to detect, because the behavior no longer feels external. It feels like personality.
Repetition changes perception by removing contrast. The nervous system stops classifying the condition as interruption once exposure becomes continuous. The individual does not consciously accept the pattern. The pattern simply remains present long enough to become psychologically invisible. And once invisibility is achieved, the system no longer needs reinforcement. Continuation maintains itself.
At first, the environment still feels intrusive. The interruptions feel distracting. The noise feels exhausting. The fragmentation feels unnatural. You notice the tension immediately. But the human nervous system does not maintain resistance forever. It adapts. Not because adaptation is healthy, because constant resistance requires energy, and eventually the mind chooses familiarity over friction. You stop noticing how often your attention breaks, how quickly silence becomes uncomfortable, how difficult it feels to remain inside a single uninterrupted thought. Not because those things disappeared, because your perception adjusted around them. That is the dangerous part of adaptation. The condition remains unchanged. Only your sensitivity to it decreases. And once sensitivity decreases, the environment no longer feels hostile. It starts feeling normal. You begin interpreting the condition as part of modern life itself, as personality, as routine.
As identity, that is how the structure stabilizes itself. Not by removing discomfort completely, by reducing your ability to recognize it clearly. Adaptation is one of the most effective stabilization mechanisms any system can produce. The environment applies continuous pressure. The nervous system gradually recalibrates around it. The individual experiences this recalibration as adjustment, but structurally it functions as alignment. The condition remains active. The perception of the condition weakens instead.
Normalization becomes far more powerful once the environment begins reflecting the same condition back at you. Because isolation creates awareness, but shared behavior creates legitimacy. You sit in a room full of people, and everyone fragments their attention the same way. A conversation pauses, someone checks a screen, someone disappears into another input for a few seconds. Nobody reacts. Not because nothing happened, because everybody already expects it. That is how environments stabilize behavior. The condition stops feeling personal. It becomes cultural. The interruptions become routine. The distraction becomes social rhythm. the absence of presence becomes ordinary interaction. And once a behavior becomes socially repeated, questioning it starts feeling unnecessary. Not because people examined the condition carefully, because repetition itself creates the appearance of correctness.
You stop measuring reality against what felt natural before. You measure it against what surrounds you now. And if the entire environment reflects the same condition back at you, the abnormal loses visibility completely. Environmental normalization removes the need for direct enforcement. The surrounding structure continuously validates the behavior through repetition. The individual interprets widespread behavior as evidence of legitimacy. Once a pattern becomes socially synchronized, resistance begins to feel irrational, and when resistance disappears collectively, the condition stabilizes itself automatically.
The most important thing normalization removes is not awareness. It removes comparison. You stop remembering what uninterrupted attention used to feel like, what silence used to feel like, what presence used to feel like. Not because those things disappeared completely, because the reference point faded slowly enough for memory to stop protecting it. That is why normalization becomes so difficult to detect. The environment does not need to convince you that the condition is healthy. It only needs to eliminate the contrast required to question it. And once comparison disappears, the condition no longer feels imposed. It feels inevitable. You begin interpreting constant stimulation as normal mental activity. You interpret fragmented attention as modern life. You interpret exhaustion as adulthood. And because every explanation feels reasonable, the condition becomes harder to identify clearly. The structure no longer feels external.
It feels like reality itself. Human perception depends on contrast. Without contrast, detection weakens rapidly. The system does not erase memory directly. It surrounds the individual with enough repetition to make alternative states psychologically distant. And once alternative states feel distant, the current condition becomes self-validating, not because it is healthy, because it is familiar.
Eventually, fragmentation stops feeling like interruption. It becomes baseline. Your attention no longer settles fully into one place. It moves constantly, from thought to notification, from conversation to stimulation, from silence to input. Not because somebody forces it to move, because stillness itself starts feeling incomplete. You begin reaching for stimulation automatically during moments that once felt normal. A pause in conversation, a quiet train ride, a few seconds without movement. The nervous system reacts immediately, not with panic, with discomfort. And discomfort creates motion. You check something, open something, refresh something, fill the silence before it fully forms. That is how fragmented attention stabilizes itself. The behavior no longer feels compulsive, it feels necessary. And once constant stimulation feels necessary, the absence of stimulation starts feeling abnormal instead.
Pause. Fragmented attention functions as a continuous environmental rhythm. The individual gradually loses tolerance for cognitive stillness. Silence stops feeling neutral. It begins triggering low-level discomfort responses. The system does not need to force stimulation continuously. The nervous system begins seeking it automatically, and once the behavior becomes self-generated, external enforcement becomes unnecessary.
At some point, the environment no longer feels separate from you. Its rhythms become your rhythms. Its pace becomes your pace. Its interruptions become part of your internal behavior. That is when alignment becomes complete. Not when the structure controls you directly. When your nervous system begins reproducing the structure automatically, you stop noticing how often you interrupt yourself, how quickly your attention escapes discomfort, how difficult it becomes to remain fully present without reaching for movement. The environment no longer needs to pressure you constantly. You continue the pattern on your own. That is why modern normalization feels so invisible. The system does not appear oppressive, because most of the behavior now feels self-generated. You believe you are choosing the rhythm, choosing the stimulation, choosing the movement.
But the structure shaped the conditions that taught your nervous system what now feels natural. And once the environment becomes psychologically internalized, resistance starts feeling unnatural instead. The final stage of normalization is behavioral self-maintenance. The individual reproduces the environmental pattern internally without requiring direct external pressure. The structure no longer feels imposed, it feels personal. And once behavior becomes psychologically identified as personal choice, the system achieves long-term stability with minimal resistance.
That is why nothing feels wrong anymore. Not because the condition disappeared, because your perception adapted faster than your awareness could track the change. You still feel fragments of discomfort sometimes, small moments, short interruptions, a strange emptiness after hours of stimulation. But even those signals weaken over time, because the mind protects continuity more aggressively than truth. You stop comparing the present to what attention once felt like. You compare it to the environment surrounding you now. And the environment reflects the same condition everywhere: constant input, constant reaction, constant interruption, constant movement. That becomes the reference point. Not silence, not stillness, not presence, just continuation. And the most effective systems do not remove your ability to function, they preserve it. You can still work, speak, reply, continue, adapt. That is why normalization hides so well.
Because dysfunction does not always appear as collapse. Sometimes it appears as ordinary life, continuing without resistance. A stable system does not require awareness to disappear completely. Only enough awareness to prevent coordinated resistance. The individual continues functioning inside the condition while gradually losing the ability to measure the condition objectively. And once adaptation becomes indistinguishable from reality, normalization reaches structural completion.
That is the real danger of normalization. Not that something harmful enters your life, that eventually you stop detecting it at all. You stop measuring reality by what feels true. You measure it by what repeats often enough, and repetition is powerful. Not because it convinces you, because it removes the comparison needed to question the condition clearly. The longer something surrounds you, the harder it becomes to remember yourself without it. Until one day, the constant noise feels natural, the fragmentation feels expected, the interruption feels automatic, and stillness starts feeling unfamiliar instead. That is when the reversal becomes complete. The abnormal no longer feels wrong. The normal starts feeling uncomfortable. And once that happens, the system no longer needs pressure. People protect what they adapted to on their own, even when the condition slowly disconnects them from their own attention, their own presence,
their own internal silence. That is why nothing feels wrong anymore. Not because the structure improved, because you normalized yourself to it. The most effective normalization systems do not depend on coercion. They depend on environmental repetition combined with gradual perceptual adaptation. The condition remains continuously present. The individual continuously recalibrates around it, and eventually, the ability to recognize the condition as abnormal degrades completely. At that point, continuation no longer requires control. The system sustains itself psychologically.
You didn't notice the condition when it entered your life. You noticed it after repetition taught you to stop resisting it. And once resistance disappears long enough, normalization begins to feel like reality itself. The ideas are human, the narration is digital. If you want to understand how it feels to live inside the condition, watch Punchline Protocol. If you want to understand how the condition became invisible, you're already here. Interpretation remains yours.